I had this great client project today and I thought that you might be interested to see what I'm doing here on this beautiful 1930s dress. We've got to change the cuffs, the collar, and make a belt to match. So if you want to watch my process in doing this, stick with me. In my life as a dressmaker, I often get given some really interesting and some really beautiful projects to work on. And as I specialize in vintage, I often get some beautiful vintage dresses to work on, just like this one here. This particular dress fits my client Bernice very well, except the arms here. These cuffs are super duper tight. It's kind of weirdly out of shape. So I suggested that we make new cuffs to go on here, and because this is all pleated, we can kind of let it out at the same time. Then of course, if you look really close, you can see the neckline here on this collar is a bit brown. And so the biggest thing, if we change the cuffs, then you want it to match the collar. So we may as well do both, since the collar needs a bit of a freshen up as well. It makes sense. But then she also had this gorgeous, look at this, yellow buckle to match. So of course we're going to make up a matching belt in the beautiful linen that we've got to match. It almost matches exactly. It's going to be so good. This is not really meant as a tutorial because I don't know what your piece looks like, and it would take me at least an hour to describe in detail that I like how to do this type of thing. This will be just watching my process and what I do on this particular garment to give you some ideas of what can be done and what you might be able to do in the future. Instead of throwing things out just because the cuffs are a little small or the neckline needs a new little bit of a freshen up, doesn't mean it's throw-out time. So this is what I like to call garment archaeology. When you start looking inside, particularly vintage dresses, or anything vintage, doesn't have to be a dress, you start to notice there's usually been quite a number of changes made after the fact. And this one's no exception. Okay, the little fun facts about this dress. When I opened it up, you can see that the cuff and everything has just been stitched straight through. Ordinarily, this cuff would come around and it would be hemmed a little bit nicer than just sort of seeing this. But, okay, when I look really closely, I can actually see that this side seam has been done with a different color thread. It's a kind of brown as opposed to the purple that has been used for the rest of it. And then looking at the waist seams, I can see where it's literally just been cut and the seams are actually still coming apart at that waist seam. So that won't last much longer. Thankfully, I've got hold of it now. So instantly I can gather that this has actually been taken in. It's been downsized through the side seams and they just kind of, you know, just run straight through the cuff down the side, which makes sense as to why this is quite small. And then something else interesting, the hem is done with a different color thread again. It's got red on it, so perhaps it was even shortened at some point as well. Vintage garments always have many lives. When you look in them, you really start to notice. Okay, first things first, I need to take off these cuffs and collar so I can actually replicate and start making some new ones. Little tip, if you're ever pulling something apart, always take pictures of it before you pull it apart. Now this has a bias spacing all around the neckline here, covering that collar seam allowance. So I'm going to have to be very careful because there's teeny tiny little seam allowances only on this. And I'm going to have to use the same one to put back on. So I have to be very careful here. So just because you see something on a garment doesn't mean that it's actually even or correct. Look how far out either side of the collar was. Heaps, it's huge. It's a big difference. So each curve was slightly different on either side. I'm going to even this up for mine. Did you see me unpicking this? I'm absolutely convinced that the sewing machines of the past were set to a stitch length of something 1.5 or something ridiculous like that. It's just sitting here just like pick, 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 pick. All the time I find like these teeny, teeny, teeny tiny little stitches on vintage dresses. It's unbelievable. Okay, leave a comment for me below if you find the same thing and it drives you crazy as well. So cuffs are back on. They went on pretty easily, which is great. I'm doing this collar now and trying to pin back on this bias tape to use as a facing is proving one of the more delicate procedures or operations that I have had to perform. So far though, it's back on. Now I just need to sew it very, very carefully and hopefully can make it look like it did before. Let's see how that goes. I have to say, there is something incredibly satisfying about fixing and repairing an item of clothing, and it looks better when you're finished with it than it did beforehand. It's a very satisfying feeling, and this one definitely covers that. It is gorgeous. So it looks so fresh and tidy now. It looks basically brand new, and I was able to put on the bias facing even better than it was actually sewn on there originally, to be honest. So, and the belt tops it off, don't you think? The little buckle just is perfect. I hope you enjoyed seeing this through the process and kind of give you ideas of don't disregard something just because it's like filthy dirty and just looks really gross. These wear out the most, and there's something that can be changed. There's a lot of little tweaks you can do to particularly vintage items like this to keep them alive and treasure them, and it's all about just sort of replicating what was already there. As always, let me know what you think of this in the comments below. I love reading them. I love hearing what if you might have done this or you think that it's something that you will attempt. Let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye. Ready? It's a magic trick. Yeah, I had to put a pin there for demonstration because that doesn't really work, does it? Needs a body in there.